If you need a shortcut to understanding the fundamental forces reshaping global security, you've come to the right place. Today, we're unpacking a profound paradox that's playing out in modern warfare. It's this idea that consumer electronics, things you can literally order online, are challenging the dominance of legacy military hardware.
It really is the ultimate contrast, isn't it? On one side of the conflict, you have soldiers holding, the classic AK-47. It's a symbol of enduring state-run military production. And then on the other side, probably the most impactful tool is effectively a shopping list.
A shopping list.
Yeah, a rapid procurement shopping list, often filled with tech sourced from Silicon Valley, from Shenzhen, or even just local electronics suppliers.
That's the core tension we're diving into. Our mission today is to analyze these two fundamentally contrasting military models operating at the same time. You have Ukraine's highly decentralized, agile commercial tech approach, what some are calling the military retail complex, versus Russia's deeply entrenched, very rigid, traditional logistics system. And the sources we've pulled for this, they provide a really stark preview of how the next generation of global conflict is going to be fought and won.
It's so much more than just a clash of strategies. It's really a conflict between two distinct economic and industrial philosophies. You've got the industrial age's rigid bureaucracy facing off against the digital age's speed and, its adaptability.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's start with Ukraine's radical systemic flip. For decades, military R&D, research and development, was a wholly state-owned thing. It was slow, it was proprietary. What we've seen since 2022 is Ukraine effectively outsourcing innovation itself.
Right. They're leveraging the rapid success and the sheer scale of civilian technologies and just adapting them really quickly for the battlefield.
And that pivot is revolutionary precisely because it bypasses the biggest choke point in defense acquisition.
Absolutely. It's all about time. The traditional model is defined by these often multi-decade acquisition cycles. By aggressively adopting commercial off-the-shelf technology, COTS, they slash procurement timelines. For crucial systems, they're going from years down to months. Or for some of these unmanned systems, just weeks.
So they're choosing good enough right now over perfect in a decade.
Exactly. They're accepting the imperfections of a readily available COTS product today rather than waiting for some perfect custom-developed defense-grade system that might never arrive.
And while Ukraine is sprinting toward this COTS integration, what was Russia relying on when the full-scale invasion began?
Well, Russia brought a logistics model designed for a war that, basically ended with the Cold War. Their material and technical support system, the MTO, is deeply rooted in that rigid, centralized Soviet structure. We'll get into the details, but the headline is really clear. It just immediately failed under the pressure of real combat. It suffered from massive internal corruption, huge logistical collapses right at the start, and an overwhelming reliance on critically outdated legacy equipment.
So if you're listening to this, why does this matter? Why does a comparative systems analysis like this matter to you, whether you're in business, government, or just trying to understand global risk?
Because this conflict is generating immediate, hard-won lessons that every major military power, and that includes NATO members, absolutely must integrate. It's a blueprint for modernization. It's testing supply chain resilience in real time, and it's defining what the future role of the private sector in national security has to be.
So simply put,
the side that organizes its bureaucracy and its supply chain to innovate faster, rather than the side that just builds the biggest platforms, is the one gaining the decisive edge.
okay, let's focus on the architecture of that innovation speed, which is Ukraine's new defense industrial base. We need to go deeper into COTOs. We know it means commercial off-the-shelf goods, the stuff that's easily accessible. But the U.S. context shows this isn't a totally new idea, right?
That's absolutely correct. The concept was embraced by the U.S. Department of Defense decades ago, especially after the Cold War. It was a way to integrate advanced components, things like high-end semiconductors, rapid computing systems, specialized IT.
Things that the commercial market was just better and faster at making.
Exactly. The tech was being driven and funded by commercial markets at a scale the defense budget could never, ever match. So the goal was twofold: save money and, more importantly, accelerate the adoption of cutting-edge innovation.
But Ukraine is applying that concept on a much, much wider scale. They're making the COTS advantage a strategic cornerstone.
Precisely. The core insight driving their success is this realization that the foundational components for modern autonomous systems are universally available. We're talking about high-density lithium-ion batteries, lightweight computing units, advanced sensor arrays, and certain composite materials for airframes.
They're commodities.
They're mass-produced commodities sold through global e-commerce supply chains. And that accessibility has allowed them to rapidly field drones and EW systems, despite Ukraine having, a limited indigenous heavy defense capacity at the war's outset. They shifted from being an inventor to being a hyper-efficient integrator.
But buying commercial gear and using it for military purposes, that must create a massive regulatory headache for the manufacturers. The dual-use dilemma.
Oh, it creates a very dangerous tightrope walk. You have to understand the legal distinction here. A dual-use item is something like a standard DJI drone or a commercial satellite terminal that has both military and civil applications. But if that item is designed or modified for military use, it immediately transforms into a military good, and that triggers strict international arms controls.
So wait, if a drone manufacturer who usually sells to, say, construction companies suddenly adds a piece of specialized software, they could be classified as an arms dealer.
Precisely. And the legal thresholds can be surprisingly low. For instance, any feature that's inconsistent with the established civilian market-like specific connectors designed only for military radios, enhanced resistance to GPS jamming, or incorporating AI that's specifically trained on military vehicles, any of that can change its classification.
So even just marketing could tip the scales.
Absolutely. If a manufacturer's website advertises a drone as being designed by or for the military or compatible with specialized military software like
The call skip.
right, the Android-based battlefield mapping platform used by NATO forces authorities will very likely treat that product as a controlled military good.
And that has huge implications. Not just for export licensing, but for personal liability for company directors.
Yeah.
It's a huge commercial risk driven entirely by the sudden military utility of what used to be consumer items.
It is, and it's a consequence of the velocity of innovation. Technology just moves faster than the laws that govern it. It forces manufacturers to make a really tough choice. Do they want to enter this highly regulated, geopolitically risky market, or do they stick strictly to civilian sales?
Now let's talk about how Ukraine forced their own system to move at that velocity. What was the pre-2022 bureaucracy like?
Oh, it was suffocating. It really reflected the institutional inertia of the inherited Soviet-era industrial base. Moving any new system from a concept to an actual prototype typically required anywhere from 3 to 20 years.
20 years.
20 years. And even after approval, contract execution, the manufacturing, the quality assurance, the delivery, that could spend another 2 to 5 years. It was slow, it was centralized, it was opaque, and frankly, ripe for corruption.
Okay, contrast that with the post-2022 acceleration.
The pace is just unrecognizable. Concept and prototyping now take mere weeks to 6 months. It's powered largely by private sector agility and COTS parts. The government realized that waiting for the full, lengthy, peacetime adoption process was, well, it was suicidal.
So they created a workaround.
A wartime shortcut. New or experimental systems only require operational approval. This is a limited clearance that authorizes their use only during the period of conflict, allowing the military to immediately test and field new capabilities without the legal commitment of full-scale adoption.
And to encourage this rapid private sector jumpstart, they needed to make the finances appealing but also fair.
Yes, exactly. They set specific financial rules for rapid acquisition, especially for high-demand items like drones and electronic warfare gear. To smooth out cash flow for smaller, rapidly scaling manufacturers, advance payments can go up to 70% of total costs for up to 12 months. That's a huge incentive. But to prevent wartime profiteering, profit margins are strictly capped at 25% of the total production costs.
And the procurement mechanism itself, this Prozoro public platform, it's adapted for security.
Correct. They use the Prozoro system, but they use a closed procedure specifically to conceal the sensitive details. Things like the contractor's identity and the tech being acquired. It's a balance between financial transparency and necessary operational security.
But maybe the most crucial change supporting frontline adaptability is decentralization.
This is absolutely key. Before the war, every unit had to rely on these cumbersome annual procurement plans dictated from Kyiv. Now, military units can procure equipment directly using either state or local funds. This flexibility allows requirements that, vary dramatically across a 600-mile front line to be met quickly.
And we have numbers on that.
We do. We saw $650 million allocated from the state budget for direct drone procurement over just an 11-month period, as reported in late 2024. That ability to push funding authority down the command chain is what enables real-time adaptation.
So the supply chain is decentralized, but how is Ukraine managing the people and the funding components of this? This is where civilian integration comes in, powered by global donations.
This parallel private acquisition pipeline is phenomenal. The Army of Drones isn't just a slogan, it's a joint project. You've got the General Staff, the State Special Communications Service, and the Ministry of Digital Transformation all working together. They run specific, goal-oriented fundraisers using digital outreach and celebrity endorsements.
Like the one with Mark Hamill, the famous Star Wars actor, raising funds for specific reconnaissance drones.
An excellent example. Those funds targeted the acquisition of RQ-35 Hydron reconnaissance drones. That's a Danish-made UAV, and it's known for being highly user-friendly and having a very robust, reliable radio system designed specifically to withstand enemy electronic warfare. Leveraging that kind of visibility and corporate organization drastically accelerates capacity deployment.
And then you have organizations that act almost like digital logistics matchmakers.
Like Protect a Volunteer, or PAV. They function as a nonprofit matching service. They connect donors directly with frontline volunteers and military units for essential tech. We're talking Starlink terminals, laptops, power packs, gear, medical supplies. It mirrors the globalized logistics of consumer retail, but it's focused on the war effort.
And on the corporate level, the contributions were also enormous and immediate.
Absolutely. Think of SpaceX activating Starlink service and providing thousands of user terminals, generators, power packs. That provided essential communications that resisted jamming far better than centralized systems. You had Baykar, the Turkish manufacturer, either donating TB2 drones outright or selling them at huge discounts. Even smaller corporations got involved. Keltec pledged 400 semi-automatic carbines. MO Inc. pledged 1 million rounds of ammunition. This is global corporate involvement on a scale we've just never seen before in a conventional conflict.
And finally, they're applying this consumer-grade digital efficiency directly to military administration.
Yeah, this is a distinct, non-traditional approach designed to reduce bureaucratic friction. We see reforms like the Reserve Plus app, which has been highly successful, used to communicate with potential recruits, simplify eligibility checks, and manage the whole process. Then there's the Army Plus initiative, which is evolving into the Impulse Analytical Database, designed to catalog the skill sets and current needs of individual soldiers.
So they're using data science to manage human capital.
Exactly. Treating soldier placement with the same logic a corporation uses to manage its workforce.
Moving now from how they buy things to what those purchases are actually doing on the front line. The new face of the battlefield is, well, it's unquestionably defined by the autonomous system. It's the democratization of air power.
UAVs are absolutely revolutionary. They have completely changed the dynamics of the battlefield by extending operational reach dramatically. That's for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR, as well as for strike and even transport roles. And importantly, they have fundamentally lowered the financial barrier to entry for achieving air superiority.
You no longer need to spend $100 million on a fighter jet to control the airspace over a certain area.
That sentiment was captured perfectly by Air Marshal Johnny Stringer, who observed that you could conduct most, if not all, of the air power roles for the price of a drone, a laptop, and some imagination. This low cost allows resource-constrained forces to execute highly complex air missions. And because rapid prototyping is possible using C.S components, and even simple additive manufacturing, like 3D printing, the technology can be iterated and deployed faster than any traditional defense manufacturer could ever manage.
This shift immediately introduces the concept of mass versus quality. If drones are cheap, how do you defend against them when they arrive in overwhelming numbers?
This is where mass becomes the critical force multiplier. We've seen the proliferation of low-cost, easy-to-produce drones, like Iran's Shahed 136 loitering munitions. They're inexpensive units used specifically in swarm tactics to overwhelm sophisticated traditional air defenses. By saturating sensors and interceptors with units that cost only a few $1,000s each, you force the adversary to expend interceptors that cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. It's an economic war.
So the key strategic shift here is moving from platform-centric warfare to network-centric warfare.
Precisely. Platform-centric warfare relies on a few expensive, high-quality, centralized systems. Think of fighter jet. Network-centric warfare, by contrast, relies on high numbers of cheap, decentralized, interconnected systems. In this new paradigm, adaptability, resilience, and speed of replacement become far more critical than raw platform quality. You just accept that you will lose assets, but your overall network remains intact.
And this adaptation isn't limited to the sky, it's happening at sea as well, using these asymmetric tools.
The naval theater offers one of the most compelling examples of low-cost, high-impact warfare. Ukraine, despite losing its conventional navy early on, has used low-cost naval kamikaze surface and underwater drones to tremendous effect. These are relatively cheap systems, but their deployment has been sufficient to push the Russian Navy out of the western Black Sea. And it's resulted in the verifiable loss or severe damage of about 20 Russian vessels. It just demonstrates that asymmetric, COTS-driven technology can paralyze a traditional major naval power.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the proliferation of all these autonomous COTS systems triggers an immediate, highly sophisticated counter-response, electronic warfare, or EW. This conflict has truly marked the return to a contested electromagnetic environment.
This is a critical historical moment. For 3 decades after the Cold War, Western forces primarily operated in, well, uncontested electromagnetic environments. Think about operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Lieutenant General Landrum observed that coalition forces were really uncontested in the electromagnetic spectrum, and as a result, Western EW capabilities kind of atrophied. Meanwhile, powers like Russia and China continued to develop sophisticated, aggressive EW systems. In Ukraine, neither side has been able to achieve clear air superiority, which has directly contributed to the conflict becoming more positional and attritional.
And the specific application of EW has been brutal on drone operations.
It has. GPS jamming is perhaps the single biggest headache. It severely degrades navigation for almost all autonomous systems and precision munitions. And on top of that, both sides are aggressively jamming communications networks, which degrades command and control and the ability of these small COTS drone fleets to operate cohesively. When facing successful Ukrainian jamming, for example, Russian forces have demonstrated advanced frequency hopping agility to try and carve out these brief operational windows for their own systems. It's a hyperactive, real-time battle for bandwidth.
So this continuous vulnerability forces a technological arms race. What are the key countermeasures being developed to ensure these systems can function without GPS?
They're being forced away from reliance on centralized, static navigation aids. So countermeasures include an increased reliance on inertial navigation systems. They use motion sensors to track position, but they suffer from drift over time. They're also moving toward line-of-sight communications, though those are vulnerable to physical interference. The crucial resilience, however, comes from developing advanced network architectures. Ukrainian forces are using satellite communications paired with highly resilient mesh networks and ground relay stations to maintain robust command and control, ensuring if one path is jammed, others remain viable.
And what does this dynamic, this high-speed digital cat-and-mouse game, imply for the future of EW systems?
The future imperative is crystal clear. EW systems must become exceptionally agile, software-defined, and fully integrated across military, government, and commercial domains. The speed of this conflict requires decision-making faster than a human can possibly process. This necessitates leveraging AI and machine learning to enable what are called cognitive EW platforms.
And what would those do?
These platforms will autonomously sense, analyze, and respond to enemy jamming in milliseconds, effectively allowing machines to fight the spectrum war at machine speed.
This contested environment also totally transformed logistics. You mentioned the vulnerability of traditional supply methods.
It proved the old dictum, disaggregate to survive, reaggregate when necessary. Large, centralized supply depots became massive targets for long-range precision strikes. The only way to achieve survivability is through distribution, breaking down those massive hubs into dozens of smaller distributed supply nodes. But that, in turn, requires extremely sophisticated command and control systems to manage assets scattered across a wide area.
And it forces a strategic shift away from efficiency models that have dominated global business for years.
Absolutely. The conflict is forcing militaries to reverse the just-in-time paradigm that commercial industry loves. Just-in-time logistics maximizes efficiency and it minimizes inventory costs, but it guarantees fragility when you're under attack. The new imperative is to focus on stockpiling supplies. Militaries have to accept the increased cost of maintaining larger distributed reserves to ensure readiness and resilience when your transportation lines are targets.
Are there technological innovations also helping logistics adapt?
Definitely. Additive manufacturing 3D printing is a key innovation here. I mean, it can't print tank, but it can rapidly produce essential spare parts, specialized tools, or customized drone components right at the forward edge. This greatly reduces dependence on vulnerable, long-distance supply chains for small but critical components.
Finally, what is the impact of all this on Western military planners, on NATO officials who are watching this war unfold?
There's a strong official recognition that they must get closer to the Ukrainian battlefield to study these evolving tactics. The drones, the EW counters, the logistics adaptations. The Atlantic Council explicitly noted that an extreme aversion to putting any personnel at risk is currently impeding comprehensive Western observation and learning from the field.
So our risk tolerance is holding us back.
Yes. That issue of risk tolerance means NATO is missing out on invaluable real-time operational data. It's forcing them to rely heavily on secondhand reports and simulation rather than immediate ground truth learning.
So while Ukraine is sprinting forward with this military retail complex, Russia is, well, it seems to be failing under the immense weight of its own rigid MTO structure, its material and technical support system. This is where that Soviet legacy is really dragging them down.
The Russian MTO is a vast, complex bureaucracy. It's centrally managed by the Ministry of Defense, but it requires deep coordination from multiple government agencies, like the Ministries of Industry and Transportation, and various commercial entities at the strategic level. So while it involves commercial actors, its foundational principles remain strictly Soviet era.
And what does that mean in practical terms for the supply chain? How does that legacy centralization manifest?
It dictates centralized management and, crucially, a push-based delivery model. This is fundamental. In a push model, commanders send predetermined units of supply, say X amount of fuel, Y number of rations forward to units, regardless of those units' actual immediate needs. It assumes static planning and rigid consumption rates. The system just lacks the real-time situational awareness or the responsive IT necessary for modern logistics because their automated systems are still in their infancy.
They're structurally locked into.
Completely locked into that inflexible push model.
And how would a modern, successful military approach that?
A modern system, like those used by logistics giants like Amazon or UPS or successful Western militaries, uses a pull-based model. The unit at the front line uses automated systems to report their exact consumption and needs in real time. And the logistics system pulls only the required supplies from the depot. This requires sophisticated IT and decentralization, both of which the Russian MTO lacked entirely.
And the initial invasion in 2022 immediately exposed this structural rigidity.
It was catastrophic. Russia's planning assumptions were optimized for a short-duration contingency, maybe a rapid intervention or a limited conflict against a smaller adversary. It was not built for a prolonged, large-scale combat operation against an adversary with high internal resistance and external supply. The forces deployed were just not self-sufficient for that kind of war.
We all remember those images of the logistical collapse in the initial push toward Kiev.
It was a textbook failure of the MTO. Early operations suffered immense problems due to rushed planning and insufficient training. Supply lines just could not keep up with those long combat pushes. Units that were staged in Belarus quickly experienced acute fuel shortages, which was compounded by poor road quality, insufficient road networks, and then repeated ambushes of their unprotected logistics columns. They failed to effectively move fuel, munitions, and, critically, spare parts.
And the force ratio was fatally mismatched from the very start.
Absolutely. Russia employed over 100 battalion tactical groups, or BTGs, in that initial phase, but they lacked sufficient MTO support to sustain them. To put that in perspective, the 2003 U.S. campaign in Iraq used a comparable total force size, but relied on only about 50 battalion-sized tactical units, supported by a much larger, more flexible logistics tail. Russia's ratio of MTO forces to combat units was simply too low to sustain those kinds of large-scale, deep maneuver operations.
Beyond the planning, the systemic deficiencies included the sheer age of the equipment itself.
Yeah, the MTO relies on heavily outdated equipment across the board. The vast majority of the motor vehicles they use are over 30 years old and just obsolete. And this isn't a minor inconvenience, it impacts maintenance and readiness across the entire force. Specialized equipment like field main pipeline support systems and modern food service equipment often lacks functioning original equipment manufacturers. That's due to past budget cuts and outsourcing decisions from the 1990s.
Why did that outsourcing happen?
During the post-Soviet budget crunch of the 90s and 2000s, the Ministry of Defense often starved domestic military manufacturers of capital. They outsourced basic maintenance and support functions to commercial entities. This severely hurt the indigenous manufacturing base, forcing some specialized factories to cease operations entirely, making it nearly impossible now to overhaul or repair that specialized equipment.
And we even saw the impact of this obsolescence on basic soldier welfare, like food.
Yes, the aging and obsolete food service equipment contributed directly to systemic issues. It resulted in reports of expired dry rations and even decayed meats being discovered by Russian service members. When you compound systemic obsolescence with rigid logistics, the end result is troops at the front are going without basic necessities.
And finally, we have to talk about the corrosive effect of endemic corruption, which just layers on top of all these structural weaknesses.
Corruption is a deep-seated issue that acts as a continuous brake on any attempt at meaningful modernization or efficiency. We see recurring reports of contract steering, improperly awarding contracts to favored, often politically connected, companies at vastly inflated costs. And this directly results in the delivery of defective goods, poor quality uniforms that fall apart, expired field rations, and substandard medical kits.
And this problem has reached the point where the state has had to start cleaning house, leading to some very high-profile arrests.
The arrests demonstrate the severity of the problem and the strain the war has placed on the system. We saw Major General Mirza Mirzaev, the deputy chief of logistics of the Russian National Guard, arrested. The allegation was that he attempted to extort a contractor supplying prefabricated building modules, requesting $1.4 million in kickbacks on a $4.9 million contract. He threatened to terminate the contract if he wasn't paid.
And the crackdown didn't stop there. It reached the highest levels of the Ministry of Defense.
Absolutely. Timur Ivanov, the deputy defense minister who was overseeing massive military construction projects, he was arrested on suspicion of accepting a substantial bribe. And other high-ranking arrests, like Major General Alexander Ogloblin and Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov on bribery charges, they indicate a state response. They're trying to address the internal corrosion that so severely undermined the MTO's performance during the initial phase of the war. They're recognizing that this internal rot is a national security risk.
Shifting our gaze outward, this conflict has immense geopolitical supply line implications. Ukraine's ability to fight relies entirely on a diverse, multifaceted international aid coalition.
The support is unprecedented. It flows from sovereign countries, from the EU, private companies, and even non-governmental organizations. And it covers everything from weaponry and training to deep logistical and financial support. For example, the EU provided around $17 billion in grants and loans just between 2014 and early 2022.
And the examples of military hardware pouring in really demonstrate the diversity of the supply chain supporting Ukraine.
The list is long and varied. Australia sent M113 AS-4 armored personnel carriers. Denmark pledged F-16 fighter jets and Harpoon missile systems. France delivered advanced Caesar self-propelled howitzers. And on the corporate side, U.S. companies like Keltec pledged hundreds of semi-automatic carbines and ammo. Inc. pledged millions of rounds of ammunition. And this is all coupled with essential training programs like the British-led Operation Interflex for Ukrainian soldiers.
But the global supply chain has a shadow side. And that's the persistent controversy surrounding China's relationship with Russia, specifically regarding the flow of dual-use goods.
The U.S. and EU have repeatedly voiced serious concerns about Chinese entities providing Russia with dual-use goods that are critical for enabling missile and drone attacks. This is perhaps the most significant geopolitical fault line today because it involves the world's two largest economies attempting to either throttle or supply a major conflict.
And how has Beijing publicly handled these accusations? We have to remain strictly impartial here, just reporting what the sources say.
Beijing has maintained a consistent and firm denial. They state that they are not providing lethal weapons. They say they strictly control all exports of dual-use goods, and that they oppose all unilateral sanctions not approved by the UN Security Council. That's all reflected in official statements from early 2025.
Yet we have reports that indicate support and interest in increasing trade.
Yes. For instance, in January 2024, China's Minister of National Defense publicly affirmed Chinese support for Russia, despite increasing pressure from the US and Europe. Furthermore, reports from 2022 indicated that local Chinese officials in provinces like Sichuan and Shandong were actively expressing interest in increasing trade with Russian entities. This demonstrates a strong underlying commercial momentum that continues regardless of the international political condemnation.
Which brings us directly to sanctions, the effort to choke off this military retail link. The EU has extended export controls specifically to target sensitive sectors in Russia's military-industrial complex.
The goal is explicitly to deny Russia access to advanced technology, particularly anything that aids its drone and missile program. The list of sanctioned items is highly revealing. It includes classic dual-use items like semiconductors, complex software for encryption, thermal cameras, and critical components like DC servo motors used in UAVs.
But the profound insight for our deep dive is how far down the consumer chain the sanctions now reach. It's a recognition that modern warfare is being fought with items available at your local electronics store or online hobby shop.
This is the definition of the military retail link being made explicit in law. The export ban now explicitly prohibits things like toy hobby drones, which are used for reconnaissance and adaptation. It bans video game controllers, which are repurposed as intuitive control systems for missiles and drones. It bans laptop computers, cameras and lenses, and radio navigational aid apparatus. The fact that sanctions have to specify video game controllers underscores that consumer technology is now officially a primary weapon system component.
It's a complete acknowledgement that the front line has been commercialized.
Absolutely. And conversely, we see pro-Russian groups using these same decentralized, commercial, and often illicit funding methods, mirroring Ukraine's agility but on the black market.
Specifically leveraging cryptocurrency donations.
Exactly. Since the start of the war, we've tracked 54 pro-Russian organizations that collectively received over $2.2 million in cryptocurrency donations, primarily Bitcoin, Ether, and Tether. These funds are used to purchase items like drones, weapons, and communication devices for paramilitary groups operating in contested zones.
And we know these crypto funding streams are often intentionally opaque.
That's right. One crypto-receiving organization, Project Terracon, received roughly 11% of its funds indirectly from Mixer's tools designed to obscure the source of funds, and it sent over 29% of its received funds to Bitslotto, a Moscow-headquartered exchange known for facilitating money laundering. This demonstrates a decentralized, commercial, and illicit financial pipeline directly supporting paramilitary operations in sanctioned regions like Donetsk and Luhansk.
This has been a really comprehensive look at two competing military visions. The key takeaway seems clear. The conflict is demonstrating a fundamental shift in what military effectiveness even means today.
That's the crux of it. The war clearly demonstrates a movement away from legacy, centralized military procurement, epitomized by Russia's struggling bureaucratic MTO and its deep-seated corruption, and toward these highly adaptive, decentralized, and COTs integrated systems championed by Ukraine. The military retail complex is not a theoretical concept. It is the reality of modern warfighting.
And the new imperative isn't just to be better, it's to adapt continuously.
Air Marshal Stringer's observation that better never stops is paramount. Military effectiveness today relies on continuous adaptation, rapid iteration, and rejecting the outdated notion of achieving some static, perfect end-state military capability. You must integrate commercial agility into your fundamental military resilience.
Which means technology is less about these monolithic platforms and more about integrated software that is constantly patched, updated, and iterated, just like a consumer app on your phone.
Precisely. And because the threat environment, cyber, EW, kinetic, is so complex and volatile, networks are always vulnerable. Success relies on distributed logistics, resilient command and control, and rapid iteration of COTS technology, borrowing directly from the civilian tech sector's philosophy of failure tolerance and speed.
This fundamentally changes the paradigm of what national security investment means. It's less about funding huge state-run factories and more about becoming a rapid integrator and modifier of globally available technology.
And that leads us directly to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. Given the extreme speed, the cost-effectiveness, and the real-time innovation demonstrated by CONAS technology on the Ukrainian battlefield, And given the inherent vulnerability of traditional, slow, multi-decade acquisition cycles, like those used by NATO's International Competitive Bidding or ICB process, which are often tied up in complexity, lengthy regulatory hurdles, and intellectual property issues, will the pressure for continuous commercial integration ultimately doom the traditional military-industrial complex as we know it, making the government primarily a rapid integrator and adapter rather than a slow custom inventor?